Russia is now waging a war on two fronts, one in Ukraine and one against its unraveling economy. From day one of the invasion, a clock started ticking, and it is one even Russian planners didn't hear. The swift freezing of foreign Russian funds and the enactment of ever-tightening sanctions meant Russia's three-day operation to take Kyiv is now a grinding three-year war, and it's bleeding Russia's finances dry. Now with Moscow blowing past yet another peace deadline from the White House, economists are warning that Russia may be trapped in a worst-case scenario, unable to stop fighting, but increasingly unable to continue. But one thing is clear, the war chest is almost empty. When this war began, Russia expected two things. It would be a swift and easy victory, and the West wouldn't do anything but impose largely ceremonial sanctions. At the time Russia held most of the cards, it already had a foothold in Ukraine with the taking of Crimea and the ongoing fighting in the east between proxy forces and the Ukrainian government. It also had what most believed to be a world-class military, more than capable of taking over Ukraine's political capital before the nation could mount an effective resistance. Russia's ace, however, was its energy trade with Europe, and the fact that Europe had since 2014 shown a greater interest in its own economic prosperity than regional security. Further evidence that Russia did not expect either a long war or a strong Western response comes from the fact that it made no effort to safeguard a massive amount of currency reserves held in foreign banks. Approximately half of Russia's total cash reserves, around $300 to $330 billion, was being held in foreign banks. Much of this money came from Russia's ongoing energy sales and was historically being kept as a rainy day fund for exactly what would come next. Except Russia never believed that the West would actually pull the trigger. Europe and the US moved quickly, freezing over half of Russia's $600 billion war chest, cutting the Kremlin off from reserves. Most of this cash was being held in Europe, specifically by Euroclear in Belgium, who has been taxing interest and giving most of that to Ukraine. The United States held about $5 billion, and Japan and close Western allies held the remaining amount. But Russia had a second rainy day fund at home, known as the National Wealth Fund. Made up from the profits of selling gas and oil, the fund has been what's keeping Russia afloat despite catastrophic losses in Ukraine. As of June of 2025, the fund is down to an estimated $39 billion from its pre-war level of $112.7 billion, and it is shrinking by the day. One of the biggest stressors on this fund is the ongoing recruitment efforts. Vladimir Putin finds himself in a tough spot because of Ukraine's ongoing resistance. To make any battlefield gains, the nation has had to throw vast amounts of manpower into the meat grinder, arguably the only way Russia has ever won a war since the start of the Industrial Revolution. However, this comes with increasing political peril, even despite Putin's tight grip on power and his critics' habit of falling out of high windows. Historically, the Russian people have just had a social contract with the Kremlin. Be as corrupt as you want to be, just don't mess with our lives. Putin has honored that unspoken pledge, but the war is upending that. To prevent civil strife, Putin has ordered ever-increasing bonuses and pay packages to new volunteers. But the pool of willing recruits, mostly from ethnic minorities and poorer regions, is drying up fast. A new round of mobilization would target the cosmopolitan cities next, places where Russians who matter, those with money and influence, live. And they're unlikely to tolerate their husbands and children being thrown into the meat grinder. Through the use of large pay packages and sign-on bonuses, Russia has been able to avert another mobilization, even if it meant sinking a large amount of the National Wealth Fund into financing Putin's manpower scheme. For all but the wealthiest of Russians, these huge pay packages can be life-changing. The average salary in Russia is just around $15,500 a year, and this is the average sign-on bonus across 37 Russian regions. Some regions offer bonuses as high as $20,000, and not too long ago, some were offering as much as $38,000 just to sign up. According to Russian data, which is likely to be cooked in order to deny the West critical information, Russia is paying around $22 million a day to sign on new recruits, or over $8 billion a year. Regional governments are being forced to shoulder about 75% of this cost, though many regions' budgets are subsidized by, you guessed it, the federal budget, and thus the National Wealth Fund. For most Russians, the offer is simply too good to refuse. But if you're wondering why these payouts haven't already blown a hole in the Russian budget, the answer lies in a darkly efficient workaround. Most of the money isn't paid up front. Recruits are only receiving the full bonus after serving for a fixed period, with the recruits receiving the largest bonuses being sent to the toughest fighting. Like the pardons once offered to convicts, few live long enough to collect them. Russian problems require Russian solutions. As the nation comes under increasing attacks by Ukraine and suffers from the effect of sanctions, its economy continues to stagnate, requiring massive bailouts. In May of this year, the finance ministry withdrew $500 million to cover the federal deficit, and billions were spent on major infrastructure projects. Around $16.5 billion was dedicated to financing a high-speed rail line between Moscow and St. Petersburg. Russia's reliance on air travel, given its vast expanses, meant that $85 million was allocated to the purchase of new aircraft. Cut off from Western manufacturers, Russia's fleet of Airbuses and Boeings have been suffering increased rates of accidents due to no new parts being available for maintenance. This has led to a slowdown in Russian air travel and using existing airframes to cannibalize parts and keep other aircraft airborne. $4 billion was also allocated to purchase new metro trains for St. Petersburg under a 25-year deal. Meanwhile, hundreds of millions more disappeared into classified military and intelligence programs, their details kept secret to avoid exposing strategic capabilities. The bulk of these funds likely went toward expanding Russia's military-industrial base, including ramping up ammunition production and upgrading defense infrastructure behind closed doors. In the end, as of June, it's believed that Russia's national wealth fund is down to just over $21 billion, with 137.3 tons of gold held in reserve, down from 394 tons before invading Ukraine. It's important to remember that Russia isn't fully funding the war from its national wealth fund. This fund has instead acted as a budgetary buffer due to shortfalls, especially against the falling price of Russian oil, and that's why it's taken years to deplete. But ever-tightening sanctions and now the threat of secondary sanctions are taking aim at snuffing this fund out. As of early June 2025, Russian oil continues to hover but is trading around $52, and Europe is set to enact a price cap of $45. This is well below the $69.70 that the federal budget needed to remain stable. If these figures don't change, the National Wealth Fund could dry up in about a year, putting a countdown on either the Ukraine war or President Putin's continued hold on power. Enforcement, though, is going to come down to clamping down on Russia's infamous Shadow Fleet, a vast array of tankers that Russia uses to bypass sanctions. But the fleet itself is more complicated than you might think. Responsible for keeping Russia's budget afloat, this Shadow Fleet is made up of two major components: the Gray Fleet and the Dark Fleet. The Gray Fleet itself is a brand new phenomenon, inspired by the ongoing war and sanctions against Russia. It's made of companies that were quickly established after the outbreak of the war and sanctions against Russia. These companies work to obscure the actual origins and the ownership of their shipping vessels, making it difficult for national law enforcement and coast guards to determine if a ship is in violation of sanctions or not. The practice of flag hopping further obfuscates the picture, with ships regularly changing their registration with different states. The Dark Fleet doesn't play pretense at legitimacy. Estimated to be made up of 1,000 vessels, it actively uses deception to hide both their cargo and its origin point. This includes things like disabling automatic identification systems and ID and location tampering, a practice that isn't just illegal, but it can be dangerous as it could potentially lead to a major collision event. Russia also uses hundreds of old ships with falsified safety credentials by which themselves can pose a major environmental hazard. The cooperation of state agents in places like Dubai, where these vessels are often registered via shell companies, makes it easier for these ships to operate. And if a ship is identified, often they'll simply sit at anchor somewhere and transfer their oil from one ship to another, something that they've been doing in broad daylight and full view of onlookers from the shore. Improvements in policing and even AI data collection and management have led to a decline in Russia's use of their shadow fleets. A big problem, though, has been ambiguity surrounding the law on interdiction in international waters, which could turn a policing operation into a military one by prompting response from the Russian military. Just such an incident occurred in May when a Russian fighter jet attempted to intimidate an Estonian Navy ship, stopping a Russian Shadow Fleet tanker. Many economists increasingly see attacking Russia's Shadow Fleet directly could be more constructive than a further lowering of the price cap on Russian oil. By making less ships available to move oil, the sanctions have a greater effect, and new policies seem to be working, with Russia's use of shadow tankers falling from 81% of crude oil exports in January to 65% in April. Russia's total fossil fuel revenues also fell 6% month by month, despite volume increasing by 1%. Russia had actually planned on a banner year in restoring payments into the wealth fund. However, falling energy prices are now derailing those plans, a casualty of Russia's overdependence on energy and its economy. And it's been commonly said, Russia isn't a nation with gas, it's a gas station masquerading as a nation. With over half of its GDP coming from its energy sector, Russia is getting hammered financially by both sanctions and ongoing attacks against its infrastructure. The latter is especially troublesome because some damage to energy infrastructure conducted by Ukraine simply can't be repaired. Russia historically has relied on Western technology to operate both its extraction and refining operations, but war sanctions put an end to those shared operations. Thus, there is some equipment that simply can't be replaced. For its part, Ukraine has been very strategic with its targeting of Russian energy. Most strikes have been aimed at either refineries or storage facilities, aiming to cause a bottleneck in Russian energy production. Refineries are very expensive to build and maintain. A single strike on critical components can cripple operations for months. Ukrainian drone strikes have repeatedly targeted key infrastructure inside Russia's refineries. Even pro-Russian commentators have admitted as much, noting just how surgically accurate these attacks have become. The double whammy of hitting storage sites also means that Russia's bottleneck is getting worse. The nation has had to limit production due to a slowdown in refining, estimated at about 10% a few months ago, and a lack of storage space. And things are set to get worse, according to 3 Russian oil executives who spoke to Reuters under the condition of anonymity. Russia will have to slow down production again. This was a major driving factor in the energy ceasefire, where both sides quit hitting each other's infrastructure. However, once Russia broke it, Ukraine resumed its deadly drone rain once again. In February 2025, Russian oil executives feared production could slip under 9 million barrels per day. This figure is set to quickly plunge if Ukraine manages to successfully strike more of Russia's refineries, and tanker shortages makes the situation even worse, with 3 of Russia's western ports reporting a downturn of 17% in exports. China and India, under international pressure and threat of secondary sanctions, have started turning away some Russian tankers. Some ports in India and China have even denied access to an estimated 1/5 of Russia's total tankers, creating a massive reserve of crude oil that the nation has had to start storing directly on the ships. It's not as simple as turning off production and then turning it on again. An oil well, once dug, can only be sealed with multiple concrete plugs, an expensive process that takes time. Restarting production means drilling through tons of concrete, and if the well is older, it needs to be flooded with water to force the oil upwards. Then there's the issue of safety. Restarting production on sealed oil wells isn't always a straightforward process. According to Clay Bretches, executive vice president at Apache Corp, it can go smoothly or turn dangerously unpredictable. And add to that the significant upfront costs that must be covered before a single barrel flows again, and it is clear why this poses serious challenges for cash-strapped Russia. Despite this, Russia is being forced to slow production and store more and more oil on tankers with no destination in mind. An environmental time bomb given the condition of some of these ships. Some in the West and even in China have expressed concern that Russia may allow a natural disaster to occur in order to pressure the world to allow its oil to flow or risk further accidents drowning global beaches in oil. Russia's daily output, dipping below 9 million barrels a day, is a critical sign of budgetary woes. It's a steep decline from the 11.25 million barrels a day the nation was producing in 2019 when it was building its national wealth fund. With the energy ceasefire off the table, Ukraine is already attacking Russian energy, further reducing storage and refining capacity. Refineries in Ryazan, Volgograd, Syzran, and Astrakhan were forced to shut down production due to previous strikes, taking between weeks to months to restore operation. Attacks on pipelines delivering oil are also wreaking havoc. Ust-Luga, sitting on the Baltic Sea, is one of Russia's biggest ports, and it cut oil transfers to tankers by half capacity in January, a 4-year low. When Russia will finally run out of money to finance its war is still a matter of debate, but the fact that its war chest is shrinking daily is not. Ultimately, actions from Washington could be the deciding factor, with the U.S. administration having the power to throw the Russian war machine a lifeline or ensure its defeat. The drying up of Russia's national wealth fund won't necessarily mean an end to its ability to wage war, but it will mean the start of extreme political risk for Putin. There have already been significant cuts to welfare programs across Russia due to budget strains and the war taking up a significant percent of the state budget. Once the wealth fund dries up, Russia will be forced to cut even deeper into social and even infrastructure programs. This risks increasing discontent, which the Kremlin, despite its death grip on Russian media, may not be able to tamp down. And worst of all, it'll come at a time when the nation has hundreds of thousands of combat veterans returning home from the battlefield, a potentially dangerous political mix for the Kremlin and a move that mirrors the fall of the Russian czars. In another 12 to 18 months, it may not be a question of if Russia can continue fighting in Ukraine or not, but rather if Putin has the political capital to keep Russia together and from falling completely apart. Even when Russia's coffers weren't overflowing, the campaign was far from smooth. Watch how Ukraine prevented Russia a day-one win to see how a planned 3-day blitz turned into a grinding battle, or click on this video instead.